The trembling started at 1:47 a.m., right on schedule. Margaret Walsh's hands shook as she clocked in at Cedar Creek Medical, the digital display blinking her arrival into the night shift log. 51 years old. 23 years since she'd walked away from Korengal Valley without a forwarding address. 14 months at this hospital. No one here knew. No one would ever know. The ER smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and something else, the metallic copper undertone of old blood, never quite scrubbed away by any mop or industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead at a frequency that never changed, a mechanical constant in the controlled chaos of 2 a.m. admissions. Margaret moved through the corridors with practiced anonymity, her limp barely noticeable after the first few steps, muscle memory compensating for a hip that had never healed quite right. The scar tissue on her forearm stayed hidden under long sleeves, even in the Houston heat that never truly left the hospital air. She hung her jacket in her locker, the movement quick and practiced. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, 75th Ranger Regiment, Korengal Valley, caught the harsh locker room light for exactly half a second before the door swung shut. No one saw it. No one ever did. The night shift at Cedar Creek Medical was different from day shift. Quieter. The skeleton crew consisted of 7 nurses, 2 residents, 1 attending physician, and Dr. Sterling, who seemed to exist in a permanent state of territorial aggression regardless of what time he was supposed to be working. Margaret had learned within her first week that Sterling preferred the night hours, fewer administrators watching, fewer protocols being enforced, less oversight when a physician decided the rules were suggestions designed for inferior people. She clipped her badge to her scrubs and moved into the ER proper. The charge nurse, a veteran named Diane who'd been at Cedar Creek for 6 years, nodded once. That was the extent of greeting. Margaret preferred it that way. The first 4 hours of her shift were routine. A diabetic crisis in bed 7. A migraine in bed 12 that screamed for morphine. A 63-year-old with chest pain who turned out to have indigestion. Margaret moved through each case with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 2 decades performing triage on casualties with actual trauma, which made her impatience with minor complaints something she had to actively manage. She took a breath. She smiled when she had to. She called doctors when protocol required it. That was the new life. Quiet. Invisible. Safe. At 2:16 a.m., the ambulance bay doors burst open and the night fractured. The paramedics wheeled in a stretcher moving fast, the kind of fast that meant someone had made catastrophic contact with something solid. The patient was unconscious, a man in his mid-20s, covered in blood that had already started to dry in the Houston humidity. Head trauma. Possible internal bleeding. Possible spinal injury. The paramedic barked vitals, blood pressure 82/54, heart rate 127, respiratory rate 28 and shallow. Got him from a car versus telephone pole, the paramedic said, moving in sync with the stretcher. Driver side impact. Lost consciousness at scene. No ID on the body. Trauma Team 1 assembled without discussion, it was automatic, the way a school of fish moved without a leader. Margaret found herself in Trauma Bay 4 before she'd consciously decided to move, her hands already reaching for the equipment before anyone assigned her a role. The resident who'd been called, a lanky third-year named Chen who'd spent 6 months terrified of Margaret's presence, gestured vaguely at the 4-pole. Somebody get 2 large ball lines. We need labs and imaging. Margaret was already moving. The patient's arms were a roadmap of purple bruising, the kind of damage that meant the paramedics had missed good access points in the chaos of extrication. She found the collapsed vein in his left antecubital fossa, the tissue swollen and useless, and moved immediately to the right arm without comment. The skin there was intact. The vein was deep but palpable. She opened the package for a 16-gauge angiocath with movements so automatic they looked casual. The needle went in at a 30-degree angle, smooth and certain. Flash of blood. She advanced the catheter another millimeter, felt the second flash, and secured it without hesitation. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. The syringe fit into the port. Saline flowed. The line was hot. "I have a line," she said, her voice level and clinical. Running normal saline wide open. Dr. Sterling appeared at the edge of the trauma bay like he'd been waiting for his entrance cue. He was 48, born into money the way some people were born left-handed, as an immutable fact of existence that required no explanation. His watch cost $12,000. His suit was pressed that morning by someone he paid to press suits. His presence in a trauma bay at 2 a.m. was unusual, which meant either he couldn't sleep or he'd been watching the monitors from his office, waiting for something worth his attention. He watched Margaret work. His jaw moved like he was grinding something between his teeth. The patient's condition stabilized as the fluids ran in. O2 sat climbed from 87 to 92 to 94. The respiratory rate dropped back to 24. Chen moved through his assessment with all the precision of someone who'd been trained but never truly tested, checking pupils, palpating the abdomen, ordering CT imaging without actually thinking about what he'd find there. Margaret started the second line on her own authority, this time a 20 gauge in the right forearm. She'd already known they'd need it. The trauma protocol at Cedar Creek Medical was run-of-the-mill, decent equipment, competent staff, but nothing like the combat medical situation she'd managed in the Korengal Valley, where the difference between a line and no line meant the difference between a soldier coming home and a folded flag. Here, at least, there were actual surgeons and clean equipment and blood products in a refrigerator instead of a cooler full of ice. Sterling moved closer. He didn't move like a doctor uncertain of his next move. He moved like a man assessing property. "Nurse Walsh," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Did I ask you to establish a second line?" The tremor started in her hands exactly then. Margaret watched it happen with the detached clinical interest of someone observing a phenomenon outside her control, the slight shake at the fingertips, the way her palms had gone clammy the moment she'd heard his voice. Her body's response to threat was still calibrated to a different kind of danger, a different kind of enemy. It took effort to remember that Sterling was just a man with a title and a grudge, not an active threat to life. She secured the second line without responding. The tape she used was clean. The placement was perfect. The rate of administration was exactly what the patient needed. "I didn't hear an answer," Sterling said. Margaret turned to face him then, and the trembling in her hand stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Her eyes went flat, not angry, not defiant, just absent of anything that could be read. It was a look she'd perfected in places where showing emotion was a liability. "Protocol allows nursing staff to establish additional access lines during code situations," she said, her voice steady and quiet. "Patient vitals were improving with the first line, but we have a prolonged transport time to imaging. Second line reduces risk of infiltration during transfer." Sterling's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, the look of a man who tried to provoke a reaction and gotten a perfectly cited regulation instead. "Fine," he said. He turned to Chen. "Get those labs sent stat. I want imaging in 5 minutes." He didn't look back at Margaret. He didn't have to. She could feel his attention on her anyway, the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm hits, that moment when the barometric pressure drops and everything living senses the shift. The trauma bay settled into its rhythm. The patient was stable enough now that the emergency had shifted from immediate life threat to managed crisis. Imaging had been ordered. The lab tech came and took blood for the standard panels. Margaret kept her hands moving because keeping them moving was better than letting them sit idle and shake. Chen approached her as the stretcher was being moved toward CT. His voice was careful, the way someone spoke to a coworker who'd just navigated a minefield without stepping on anything. "That was good line placement," he said. "The second one, I mean. I wasn't going to think of that." "You would have," Margaret said. "You were just a few seconds behind." It was the kind of lie that was technically true. Chen probably would have ordered a second line eventually. But he wouldn't have known how to place it in a patient with collapsed veins. He wouldn't have understood that the difference between a good line and a bad line was sometimes the difference between saving a patient and watching them decompensate because access kept failing. She'd learned that lesson in a place where you didn't get a second chance if you failed the first one. Sterling was still in the ER at 3:42 a.m. when Margaret finished documenting the trauma case. She didn't understand why he was still here. There was nothing happening that required his attention. The patient was in imaging. The crisis had passed. The hospital's night operations were proceeding according to protocol. But Sterling was at the physician's station, reviewing her notes on the computer. His expression was the particular look of a man searching for something he could criticize, his cursor moving through her assessments with the precision of someone inspecting a crime scene. He found nothing. Her documentation was perfect. Her times were accurate. Her assessments were thorough. Everything was in order, which made it even worse, because a perfect file couldn't be attacked. It could only be noted as suspicious. He printed her note on the trauma case. Slowly. Deliberately. Like the act of printing her work made it evidence of something. Diane approached Margaret at the break room at 3:58 a.m., moving quietly so no one else would hear the conversation. "Sterling's been watching you all shift," Diane said. Her voice was low. She was a good nurse, the kind who understood that some problems couldn't be solved with protocols. "He's got something against you. I don't know what yet, but he's building a file." "I haven't done anything wrong," Margaret said. "That doesn't matter," Diane said. She was older than Margaret, with 30 years at Cedar Creek and enough scar tissue from office politics to know how these things worked. "He sees that you're competent and he can't stand it. He's going to keep watching until he finds something. Or until he makes something." Margaret nodded. She understood how power worked. She'd seen it in 100 forms, the kind that came from rank, the kind that came from weapons, the kind that came from institutional position and the willingness to weaponize it against people smaller than you. Sterling was a man who'd never been tested by actual emergency, and that made him dangerous in a different way. He'd learned to compete within systems instead of surviving them. At 4:47 a.m., Sterling found her in the medication room restocking the crash cart. "My office," he said. "Tomorrow. After your shift. We need to discuss your performance." Margaret didn't ask why. She already knew. He'd reviewed her charts. He'd found nothing. And he'd decided that was the problem, that no one could be that competent without overstepping, that perfection itself was evidence of insubordination. She hung her jacket back in her locker as the morning shift arrived, the faded unit patch catching the light one more time before the door closed. The trembling had started again, but quieter this time. The kind of tremor that was just her body remembering that threat had 1,000 shapes, and some of them wore white coats and carried institutional authority. She walked out into the Houston heat and didn't look back. What she didn't know was that Sterling had already decided exactly how he was going to break her. He'd been planning it since the moment he'd watched her establish that second line with the kind of precision that made his 4 years of medical training feel insufficient. He didn't know who she really was. He didn't understand what he was standing next to. That was the worst mistake of his life. Room 407 smelled like antiseptic and fear. The elderly patient lay propped on pillows, her daughter pacing the foot of the bed with the rigidity of someone preparing for war. Margaret entered carrying the patient's chart, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become her armor. She didn't know Dr. Sterling was already inside, standing near the window with his arms crossed, waiting. "Ah, Nurse Walsh," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Perhaps you can explain your unauthorized decision to order comprehensive metabolic panels without physician approval." The daughter's head snapped toward Margaret. The chart in Margaret's hands felt suddenly heavy. The patient presented with confusion and hypokalemia, Margaret said, her voice level. "Standard protocol for her presentation." "Standard protocol," Sterling repeated, and he smiled, the kind of smile a predator wears before it strikes. "Or did you decide to practice medicine tonight?" He turned to the daughter, his gesture dismissive. This is what happens when support staff overreach their qualifications. "I apologize for clipboard here thinking she's a doctor." The daughter's face hardened. She looked at her mother, then at Sterling, then at Margaret, as if trying to determine which one she could trust. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a sickly blue pallor. One of them hummed slightly, a sound like the edge of pain. "Can I speak to someone actually qualified?" the daughter asked. Margaret set the chart down on the bedside table. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her, could feel him waiting for the crack, the tremor, the moment when shame would make her smaller. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. She had stood in rooms where men died. She had held arterial bleeds together with her bare hands while waiting for backup that might never come. She had learned, long ago, that insecurity looked exactly like cruelty, and that cruelty always announced itself first. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor," Margaret said, her voice dropping into a register so calm it sounded like the air pressure had changed. "And it's unbecoming." She turned, spine straight, and walked out of room 407. Behind her, Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. 1 week later, Margaret sat in the break room with a cup of black coffee, her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic like it might hold something essential. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't care. 3 nurses entered through the double doors, Rodriguez, Chen, and someone new whose name Margaret still didn't know. They were laughing about something, their voices bright and alive. Then they saw her. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Not with a fade. It stopped like a switch had been flipped. Rodriguez glanced at Chen. Chen glanced back. The new nurse suddenly became very interested in the refrigerator. "Oh, I just remembered," Rodriguez said. "I need to check on my patient." "Paperwork," Chen added, "already moving." "Lots of it." Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for Margaret and the hum of the refrigerator. She sat perfectly still, staring into the dark mirror of her coffee. Her reflection stared back, jaw clenched, eyes flat, the look of someone holding something down. She could hear their voices in the hallway, the way they waited until they were around the corner before they started talking again. This happened on Tuesday. On Wednesday, it happened again, for nurses this time. She watched them leave one by one, their exits choreographed like a ballet of avoidance. She heard fragments of their conversations through the walls. Sterling said she has episodes. And something about her past. An erratic behavior, apparently. The words floated through the air like poison gas, invisible but deadly. By Thursday, Margaret had stopped waiting for the break room. She took her coffee to the supply closet instead, sitting among boxes of gauge and syringes, where nobody expected to find her. Even that felt like an invasion by Friday. Friday was when Dr. Sterling posted the write-up. It appeared on the central unit board during shift change, printed on official hospital letterhead, centered and impossible to miss. Nurses gathered around it like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Margaret watched from the medication dispensary, watching their faces, watching them read the words Sterling had typed with the precision of someone composing a death warrant. Written warning, Margaret Walsh, RN. Insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Unauthorized clinical decisions. Further violations will result in termination. He had signed it. He had dated it. He had made sure every staff member would pass this board at least 3 times during their shift. The humiliation was the point. The documentation was just the weapon. Margaret walked to the board while a dozen eyes tracked her movement. She read the notice slowly, letting each word settle into its place. Her face remained expressionless, the face of someone who had already survived worse, whose composure had been forged in places where showing weakness meant bleeding out. She turned, and Dr. Sterling stood 10 feet away, watching her with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally broken something. "Competence must be terrifying," Margaret said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "when you've never had to earn respect." She walked to her station. Behind her, Sterling's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He couldn't. Because she was right, and somewhere beneath his anger, he knew it. The trauma alert came through the overhead speaker at 22:47, cutting through the evening shift like a blade. "Incoming medevac, combat medic, 24 years old, shrapnel wounds to thoracic cavity, ETA 8 minutes. The emergency department transformed instantly. Nurses moved to their stations. The trauma bay opened like a mouth. Margaret's hand steadied on the supplies she was restocking. The patient's age, 24. The origin, medevac from Afghanistan. The injury, shrapnel to the chest. She had seen these wounds before. She had caused these wounds before. She had failed to save people with these wounds before. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad with a sound like the end of the world. Within 3 minutes, they were wheeling him through the automatic doors, and Margaret could see his uniform, the patches on his shoulders, the blood already soaking through the emergency dressings. She could see the unit patch sewn onto his sleeve, 75th Ranger Regiment, same as hers had been years ago in a different life. SPC Michael Reeves. Combat medic. Age 24. When she cut away his uniform to assess the trauma, her hands froze for exactly 2 seconds. His dog tags read the same blood type as hers. His personnel file, pulled by the admitting clerk, showed his last assignment, Korengal Valley, attached to Phi Base, Montana, the exact position Margaret had occupied 3 years ago before the nightmares became too loud and she disappeared. This boy was doing the job that had broken her. She processed his military ID with automatic efficiency, logging it with patient belongings, following protocol. No identification in the system triggered next of kin notification procedures. Dr. Sterling reviewed the case, his eyes moving across the chart, and Margaret watched the moment he realized she was assigned to this patient. His jaw tightened. He made a phone call to the helicopter transfer service, priority evacuation to Fort Sam, Houston, 6 hours maximum. Cutting her out of the critical window. But the sky had other plans. The storm was moving faster than the weather service predicted. By the time they got word, the helicopter flights were already grounded. Thunder rolled across Houston like artillery, and Margaret checked the young medic's CT scan again during her break, shrapnel fragments near the pulmonary artery, stable but precarious, a ticking clock nobody could see. She sat with him for 12 minutes, studying his face, seeing herself at 25. "You don't know me," she whispered to the unconscious body before her, "but I know exactly where you've been." And that's when the monitor alarm began its slow, irregular beep. The monitor's irregular beep became a drumbeat. Thump. Pause. Thump thump. Thump. The pattern of a heart losing its argument with physics. Margaret stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. SPC Michael Reeves. 75th Ranger Regiment. The name on the dog tags hanging from the unconscious medic's neck was the name she'd tried to bury for 8 years. Not just any young combat medic. The young combat medic. The one who'd taken her position at Phi Base Korengal after she'd walked away. The one doing the job that had broken her spine from the inside out. Her hands moved first. They didn't wait for permission from her brain. They knew what broken spines and internal bleeds looked like. They'd held them together before. BP's dropping, she said, her voice steady. 89/51. Down from 94. Rate climbing to 118. Dr. Sterling arrived 4 minutes later, moving through the ER with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd never been questioned. Rain hammered the windows behind him like static. The storm had grounded the Black Hawk transfer helicopters 20 minutes ago. No air evacuation. No surgical center 30 miles north. Just Cedar Creek Medical and the narrow window of what could be done with what they had. Sterling reviewed the monitors without touching the patient. He didn't need to. The numbers told him everything he wanted to know. CT scan, he said. Full torso. Rule out aortic involvement. He won't survive transport, Margaret said. Sterling's eyes found hers. They were the color of ice that had never thawed. I'll decide what he survives, clipboard. Get him to imaging. Margaret had learned Sterling's language in the last 3 months. Every word was a weapon. Every order was a test. She'd passed them all by accepting humiliation the way soldiers accept mud as part of the uniform. But this wasn't a written reprimand or a dressing down in front of a patient's family. This was a young ranger bleeding out while a man with credentials and a nameplate made decisions based on ego instead of vitals. She watched the resident tech roll the stretcher towards CT, watched Sterling return to his computer, typing notes with the precision of a man documenting his righteousness. Watched the storm press against the windows like something alive and furious. The pressure dropped again. 86/48. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound of lungs that were starting to understand what their body wouldn't admit yet. Hemorrhagic shock moves like a shark. Once it tastes blood in the water, there's no negotiating with it. Margaret approached Sterling at the nursing station. She kept her voice low. 3 other staff members were visible, but far enough away that Sterling could pretend she didn't exist if he wanted to. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he made her repeat herself twice before acknowledging she'd spoken. His pressure's dropping despite fluids, Margaret said. The shrapnel wound, the CT won't help if the internal bleed accelerates before imaging finishes. He needs surgery now. The fragments likely eroding through a major vessel. Sterling didn't look up from his screen. He's stable enough for imaging. He's not. That wasn't a question. Clipboard. Sterling's voice was a knife with no blade, all edge, no substance. Get him to CT. Now. Margaret felt something shift behind her ribs. Not fear. Not rage. Just the recognition of a decision point approaching at full speed. She'd seen this moment before. In Korengal Valley, in a phi base with dirt floors and mortar rounds walking closer every 5 seconds, she'd seen soldiers die because the only doctor on site followed protocols instead of listening to the combat medic standing 3 feet away. She turned and walked to the ER entrance. The automatic doors opened like a mouth. Rain slammed the parking lot. It was 2:47 a.m., and the sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming yet. Her car was a 2011 Honda Civic with 147,000 miles and a trunk that held her entire invisible life. She popped it open and reached past the spare tire, past the canvas bag of emergency supplies, until her fingers found the canvas roll she hadn't unrolled in 8 years. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. The roll opened like a scar that would never fully close. Hemostats. Retractors. Instrument scissors with the edges sharp enough to make air sing. A tourniquet from 2015. And at the center of it all, a combat knife with a 7-inch blade and a handle wrapped in electrical tape that had yellowed like old teeth. The blade was folded steel that had learned to cut through things that screamed. The handle was worn smooth from hands that had known no other choice. She held the knife for 5 seconds. 7. The rain found its way under her scrubs. The wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the loading dock where ambulances came back from houses where people had stopped breathing. She'd left this part of herself behind in a storage unit in Northern Virginia, along with the rest of the armor. The dog tag she didn't wear anymore. The photographs of Phi Base Korengal with faces crossed out in permanent marker. The unit patch, faded from sand and sun, that she'd sewn inside the lining of her old field jacket, the one that hung in the back of her closet under a garment bag that had never been opened in Houston. She'd left it all behind because leaving was the only way to survive it. SPC Michael Reeves' oxygen saturation was 74%. 14% above the edge. Falling like a stone dropped in deep water. Margaret wrapped the canvas roll and placed it on the passenger seat of her car. She stood in the rain for 30 seconds more, letting it wash the parking lot grime off her skin, letting it remind her what cold felt like. Then she turned back toward the automatic doors. The new graduate nurse, Chelsea, maybe, or Christina, stood frozen at the bedside monitor, watching the numbers decline like she was reading a language she'd never studied. The intern stood beside her, phone in hand, staring at Sterling's closed office door. The resident who actually knew what she was looking at was 3 floors up, reassigned to pediatrics 20 minutes ago on Sterling's orders. There was no one in this room who understood that certain patterns of deterioration don't wait for morning shift. Certain patients don't survive the next 2 hours if you follow protocol instead of combat medicine. Margaret moved through the ER with the terrible calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She didn't run. She didn't gesture. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked back to the bedside and looked at the medic's face, young, early 30s, the jawline of a man who'd been lean since birth and hadn't eaten enough in Korengal Valley to fix it. His left hand was wrapped in gauze. His dog tags caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a prayer. She looked at Sterling's office. The door was closed. He was on his phone, probably, calling the attending surgeon, probably reassuring him that this case could wait for morning rounds. Probably creating the architecture of a decision that would kill a young man who'd done the job Margaret had abandoned. She placed her hand on the ranger's shoulder. Just for a moment. Just long enough to say what she couldn't say out loud: I know where you've been. I know what you've done. I know why you're here instead of home. And I'm not losing you to a man who thinks credentials are a substitute for courage. Then Margaret Walsh walked out of the ER. She was dismissed from this case. Security would remove her if she stayed on the floor. She knew the rules. She'd followed them for 8 years because following rules was how you disappeared. How you stopped being visible. How you kept yourself from becoming a problem that needed solving. She walked to the parking lot. She opened her trunk. She took inventory of the tools she'd promised herself she'd never use again. And then her phone rang. The number on the screen had no name attached. Just digits. But she recognized it anyway. A Pentagon direct line, buried in the contact history of a phone she'd bought in 2016 and never deleted. A number that meant only one thing when it called. She answered. Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh, a woman's voice said. Not a question. A confirmation. We have a situation at Cedar Creek Medical in Houston. Are you available? Margaret looked back at the hospital. At the emergency room entrance where rain was now falling sideways, where a young ranger was in a room with Sterling, where the window for intervention was closing like a fist. I'm available, Margaret said. The voice on the phone said 5 words that changed everything. We know you are. The pressure dropped to 70/40 at 2:13 a.m., and the monitor screamed it like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Michael Reeves, the young ranger with shrapnel still embedded near his left lung, was hemorrhaging somewhere the ultrasound couldn't find, internal bleed, massive, the kind that killed soldiers in medevac helicopters and would kill him on this gurney if nobody opened him up in the next 6 minutes. Dr. Sterling was on the phone in the physician's lounge, his voice smooth as oil on water. I understand the weather. I'm asking when we can clear a bird. The meteorologist on the other end of the line gave him the answer Sterling didn't want: 6 hours minimum. The storm had grounded everything from Houston to San Antonio. No helicopters. No trauma center. Just Cedar Creek Medical, a level 2 facility, and a dying young man whose chest was filling with blood Sterling had ordered imaging for instead of an OR. Margaret heard the monitor flatline from the break room where she'd been sitting with her hands wrapped around cold coffee she hadn't tasted. She didn't get up. She wasn't on the case anymore, Sterling had made that clear. The new attending, Dr. Vasquez, would handle it. Then the overhead crackled, code blue, Trauma Bay 4. Ranger Protocol. Ranger Protocol meant the patient was military. Meant nobody was calling it in casual. Margaret set down her coffee, stood, and moved toward the ambulance bay without thinking about it, the way muscles remember things the brain tries to forget. Her combat surgical kit was still in her car, wrapped in a weatherproof bag beneath the spare tire, exactly where she'd placed it when she started her first shift at Cedar Creek 3 months ago. She'd told herself it was just habit. She'd lied. The storm outside was hammering the parking lot like automatic weapons fire, rain sheeting sideways, wind that would have grounded rotors if any birds had been foolish enough to try. Margaret grabbed the bag from her trunk, the metal cold against her palm, and ran back inside with the kind of focused urgency that made staff step out of her way without asking questions. When she pushed through the trauma bay doors, Reeves' pressure was already dropping past 65, his skin the color of old newspaper, his eyes half open and seeing nothing. The new nurse on the case, a girl named Rebecca who'd been at Cedar Creek for 4 months, was running fluids, but fluids couldn't fix internal hemorrhage. Nothing could fix it except opening him up and finding the bleeder, and that required someone with steady hands and 23 years of muscle memory. Margaret ripped open the medic's gown. "What are you doing?" a resident stammered. "He's not your..." Margaret didn't answer. She pulled a combat knife from her surgical kit, the blade 8 inches of surgical steel, and placed it against the medic's chest at the left fifth intercostal space. One smooth stroke. The skin parted. She reached for the rib spreader from the crash cart, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving with the terrible precision of someone who'd done this in a fire base in Korengal Valley with nothing but flashlight and prayer. The ribs cracked open like a door. Blood welled. Not arterial spray, that would have been easier, somehow. This was darker, pooling in the cavity, the kind of bleed that whispered death instead of screaming it. Margaret's hand went into the chest cavity, her fingers finding the source through blood-warm sensation, locating the pulmonary artery laceration with the certainty of someone reading Braille written in trauma. Suction. Clamp. Now. Her voice had transformed, dropped 2 octaves, became the voice of a senior chief petty officer who'd commanded respect from men carrying weapons in a war zone. The residents moved like puppets on strings they hadn't known were attached. Someone handed her the suction tip. Someone else slapped the vascular clamp into her palm. She worked for 4 minutes with her hand inside his chest cavity, isolating the vessel, applying pressure, damming the hemorrhage with fingers that had steadied 100 dying soldiers. The medic's pressure climbed, 55. 60. 65. 70. Margaret didn't suture. The attending trauma surgeon would do that, would arrive in 90 seconds, running, his eyes wide. She pulled off her gloves and stepped back, leaving the chest open, leaving the clamp in place, leaving the evidence of what she'd done written in blood on her scrubs and on her hands. "Who the hell did this?" the trauma surgeon demanded, skidding to a stop. "I did," Margaret said. 6 words. That was all. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like a ghost someone had summoned without meaning to. His eyes moved across the medic's cracked ribs, the open thoracotomy, the surgical clamp Margaret had positioned with the precision of a combat surgeon. His face drained white, then flushed red, then went pale again as if his body couldn't decide which emotion was supposed to win. He said nothing. The look he gave Margaret contained no anger, worse than anger. It contained calculation. She'd seen that look before, on men who were deciding how to destroy her, and she recognized it for what it was, the moment a predator realizes it's been outmatched and decides to switch tactics. 6 hours later, after the medic was stable in ICU post-op, after the trauma surgeon had told the residents that whoever performed that field thoracotomy had probably saved Reeves' life, after the hospital had returned to its humming night shift routine, Sterling summoned Margaret to his office. The door closed with the soft precision of a trap springing shut. He didn't raise his voice. Controlled men never did. Gross violation of protocol. Unsanctioned surgical intervention outside your scope of practice. You're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. He slid the termination papers across the desk with 2 fingers, as if they were contaminated. Margaret signed without reading them. Her hand was steady. Her voice was steady. "You'd rather he died than let me save him." Sterling's eyes flicked up from his desk. "I'd rather maintain standards than indulge your hero complex. You're not a surgeon. You never will be." Margaret placed her badge on his desk beside the papers. The metal caught the fluorescent light. She left without saying anything else. There was nothing else to say to someone who'd chosen procedure over a human being's life, who'd valued his authority more than a 24-year-old soldier's heartbeat. 2 o'clock the next afternoon, Margaret sat at her kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, the fabric stiff with dried blood that wouldn't wash out because she hadn't bothered drying. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something for so long that when you finally set it down, your body doesn't know how to hold itself anymore. Her daughter Emily came home early from work, came through the door the way she always did, calling out, "Mom, I left my," and then stopped. Stop dead. Stop the way people stop when they recognize something has fundamentally changed and they're staring at the ruins. Emily was 28, a lawyer, sharp as fractured glass, and she'd never in her daughter's life seen Margaret cry. Seeing it now made her entire face reorganize itself. "Mom? Why are you home? What happened?" Margaret couldn't answer. The words existed in a language she didn't speak anymore, a language that required vulnerability, and she'd spent 23 years learning not to be vulnerable in front of anyone who loved her, because vulnerability was a wound, and wounds got infected, and infected wounds got people killed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next, 3 days later, when the young Ranger medic opened his eyes in the ICU and a nurse showed him photos of the ER team. When his eyes locked on Margaret's face in a staff photograph and his breath came in a whisper. When he spoke her call sign like it was a prayer. When the truth started its avalanche, and nothing in Dr. Sterling's careful calculations could have predicted the force of it, or the precision with which it would dismantle everything he'd built. Dr. Sterling's office was on the 4th floor, corner window overlooking the parking lot where rain hammered the asphalt like applause for a performance only he understood. He sat behind his desk at 11:47 p.m., the hospital corridor outside his door empty, and made the first call. Administrator Chen's voicemail. He left it clean, professional, measured. "We have a serious protocol violation in trauma. Margaret Walsh performed and sanctioned surgical intervention. I have documentation. We need to discuss containment." Click. He made the second call at midnight. The hospital board chairman. Same message, different phrasing. Patient safety issue. Gross violation of protocol. I've been documenting. The third call went to the chief of surgery. By 1 a.m., Sterling had called 7 people. He hadn't raised his voice once. His competence in destroying careers was as practiced as hers had been in saving lives, and that distinction mattered to him in ways he couldn't articulate without sounding pathetic. The real work started the next morning. Sterling walked into the break room where nurse Patricia Holloway was collecting her bags for the day shift. She'd been standing 8 feet from Margaret during the thoracotomy. She'd watched every move. She was the only witness with medical credibility who could corroborate what happened. Sterling smiled, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Patricia, we're reassigning you to the day shift trauma rotation. Effective immediately. New schedule on the board." Patricia blinked. "But Dr. Sterling, I like nights. It's not a request. It's a restructuring." He turned away. She never finished her sentence. By 10 a.m., Patricia had been moved to a different shift, a different team, separated from any investigation that might ask her what she'd witnessed. Narrative control required removing the testimony. Sterling then called the surgical scheduling department and altered the overnight operating room logs for the night of the thoracotomy. The documentation would show that the case had been logged as the non-emergent imaging instead of the catastrophic hemorrhage it actually was. His allies, 2 junior attending physicians and a surgical resident who owed him recommendation letters, were assigned to every trauma review committee meeting that would follow. They would see the altered schedule. They would echo his version. They would be confused, then compliant. The documentation would support his position. Margaret had performed an unnecessary, unauthorized procedure on a stable patient. Then Sterling pulled Margaret's incident report file from the medical records office and had it transferred to his office. Administrative review, he told the clerk. No access to this file until we've completed our investigation. The clerk nodded. It was a routine request. Margaret arrived at the hospital the next afternoon to find she couldn't access her own defense. The incident report sat in Sterling's filing cabinet while he crafted the official narrative around it. Friday afternoon, 3:30 p.m. Sterling's office door closed. Margaret sat across from him in a chair that faced his desk, her hands folded in her lap, her posture exactly what it had been for 23 years of military service, shoulders back, spine straight, expression neutral. She was waiting. Sterling opened a folder with Margaret's name on the tab and began to read from a document he'd prepared over the last 72 hours. His voice was calm, almost regretful. "Margaret, your performance record shows exemplary nursing skills. That's not in dispute. However, your conduct on the night of August 14th represents a fundamental violation of hospital protocol, chain of command, and basic patient safety standards. You performed a surgical procedure without authorization, without a surgeon present, without sterile conditions, without surgical backup. That's gross violation. That's also abandonment of your assigned duties and insubordination." He paused, letting the word settle. "The hospital has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. We'll process your final check through payroll. Security will escort you out. Your nursing license will be reported to the Texas Medical Board as a precaution. We recommend you seek legal counsel." He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He delivered her dismissal the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis, with clinical precision and zero emotional investment. Margaret didn't blink. She stood. "I understand." That was all. She walked to the door, and Sterling watched her leave with the satisfaction of a man who had just eliminated a threat using nothing but institutional leverage and careful documentation. He didn't know that everything he'd just said was built on altered schedules, reassigned witnesses, and stolen medical records. He didn't know any of that yet. Margaret drove home in the rain with her final paycheck in her bag and 23 years of hidden service in her bones. She'd walked away from Korengal Valley deliberately, no forwarding address, no explanations, no contact with anyone from that life except the Navy, which technically still owned her time and her skills even if she'd tried to give them back by becoming invisible. She'd told no one, not even her adult daughter Emily, where she'd gone or what she'd done before Cedar Creek Medical. That evening at 2 in the afternoon, still in her scrubs, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee and let herself cry. Not the kind of crying that comes from weakness. The kind that comes from holding a line so long that when you finally step back from it, the exhaustion becomes something physical. It settled in her chest like shrapnel that would never fully come out. Emily found her there when she came home from work. Her mother, the woman who'd never shown pain, never admitted struggle, never explained why she'd disappeared from the life her daughter thought they shared, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon on a Friday, still wearing scrubs, with tears on her face that had nowhere left to hide. Emily set her bag down slowly. "Mom? Why are you home? Your shift doesn't end until 8. Margaret couldn't answer. Not yet. Not without explaining everything, and the weight of that explanation felt heavier than the knife she'd used to crack open a patient's chest. It felt heavier than the secret she'd kept. Emily sat down across from her mother and waited, understanding that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful architecture of Margaret's hidden life had just collapsed, and that whatever came next would change everything they both thought they knew about who Margaret Walsh actually was. The silence lasted 3 minutes. Then Emily's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Is your mother Margaret? We need to talk about what happened in the ER." Emily looked at the message, then at her mother, and understood that whatever Dr. Sterling thought he'd accomplished by destroying Margaret's career was about to become the smallest detail in a story much larger than anyone at Cedar Creek Medical had anticipated. The young medic had woken up in the hospital 3 hours ago, seen Margaret's face in a photograph a sympathetic nurse had shown him, and whispered a single word that would shake everything loose, a call sign from a valley on the other side of the world, spoken by a soldier who recognized the warrior who'd saved his life. The avalanche had started. The call would come tomorrow. The Pentagon already knew. The investigators were already moving. But tonight, Margaret sat in silence with her daughter and let the first real thing in 3 years break open in her chest, the possibility that hiding was over, that the quiet erasure she'd chosen was no longer hers to control, and that being Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, even if the world learned it in the worst possible way, might be a weight worth carrying. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.